Picture this. You're a distinguished Roman senator, one of the most respected men in the empire. Your family name goes back generations. Your toga bears the purple stripe of nobility. And you've spent decades serving Rome with honor. Tonight, you've received a golden invitation to dine with the emperor himself. An honor that should fill you with pride. But as you climb the marble steps of the Palatine Hill Palace, your stomach churns with dread. The guards at the entrance don't meet your eyes. They know what you're walking into, and their silence speaks volumes. The scent of expensive incense can't quite mask something else. Fear thick and suffocating in the air. You enter the great hall where dozens of Rome's elite are already gathered. Senators, their wives, wealthy merchants, military commanders, all standing in uncomfortable silence. Then you hear it, the sound of footsteps echoing through the corridor, accompanied by manic laughter that makes your blood freeze. Emperor Caligula enters, dressed in silk that shimmers like liquid gold, his eyes bright with an unsettling intensity. He surveys the room like a predator studying prey, then claps his hands together with theatrical delight. "My dear friends," he announces, his voice echoing off the marble walls. "Tonight we shall discover who among you truly loves your emperor. Tonight we shall see just how far you'll go to prove your loyalty." What follows will shatter every boundary of Roman decency, turning the sacred halls of power into a stage for the emperor's darkest appetites. This is the story of how one man's madness corrupted an entire empire and how absolute power became absolute corruption. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. To understand how the most powerful man in the world could transform his palace into a den of sexual depravity and psychological torture, you have to understand how Caligula became the emperor in the first place. Born Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus in 12 CE. He earned his nickname Caligula, meaning little boots, as a child when he accompanied his father Germanicus on military campaigns dressed in miniature soldiers' gear that charmed the legions. But childhood for a member of the imperial family was anything but innocent. By the time he was 7, Caligula had witnessed his father's mysterious death, possibly by poisoning ordered by Emperor Tiberius. He watched his mother, Agrena the elder, and his brothers disappear into exile, imprisonment, and eventually death. Victims of the paranoid machinations of imperial politics. Imagine being a child and knowing that at any moment the knock on your door might be your last. Caligula learned to survive in a world where showing weakness meant death, where trust was a luxury no one could afford. He became a master of deception, presenting himself as harmless while his family was systematically destroyed around him. This early trauma would later manifest in his compulsive need to dominate and humiliate others, particularly those who reminded him of the power structures that had terrorized his youth. When Tiberius finally died in 37 CE, the Roman people welcomed 24-year-old Caligula as emperor with genuine joy. Here was the son of their beloved Germanicus, the boy who had once charmed the armies. Rome had suffered under the paranoid, reclusive Tiberius for decades. They were ready for someone young, someone who promised a return to the glory days. For 7 months, Caligula seemed to be everything they had hoped for. He recalled political exiles, gave generous bonuses to the Taurian Guard, and held spectacular public games. The people loved him. But then something changed. Something that would transform the imperial palace from a seat of governance into a playground for the emperor's most twisted sexual fantasies. In late 37 CE, Caligula fell seriously ill with what ancient sources describe as a brain fever so severe that it brought the empire to a standstill. For days, he hovered between life and death while Rome held its breath, praying for their young emperor's recovery. Some historians believe this illness caused permanent brain damage, while others argue it simply stripped away the thin veneer of sanity that had been holding his darker impulses in check. When Caligula recovered, those closest to him noticed the change immediately. The young man who had once shown restraint and political wisdom was gone. In his place stood someone who seemed to have lost all connection to reality. All sense of boundaries between the sacred and profane, the acceptable and unthinkable. The transformation wasn't immediately obvious to the public. It began with small things, excessive spending, unusual behavior in private meetings, increasingly erratic decisions. But behind the closed doors of the imperial palace, a much darker change was taking place. Caligula had discovered something during his brush with death. The intoxicating realization that as emperor, he could do literally anything to anyone, and no one could stop him. The palace staff were the first to witness Caligula's transformation. Servants who had served the imperial family for years suddenly found themselves subjected to the emperor's bizarre whims and sexual demands. Young male slaves were particularly vulnerable. Caligula would summon them to his private chambers and force them to participate in acts that violated every concept of Roman dignity. But it was the female servants who suffered most. Ancient sources written in the careful language of their time describe how the emperor would prowl the palace corridors at night, selecting women at random to satisfy his appetites. These weren't consensual encounters. They were acts of pure dominance designed to reinforce Caligula's absolute power over everyone in his domain. The emperor's sexual appetites weren't limited to servants. He began inviting the wives of senators and other high-ranking officials to private audiences, ostensibly to discuss their husbands' careers or family matters. These women, raised in the strict moral codes of Roman aristocracy, found themselves trapped in situations where refusing the emperor's advances meant death, not just for themselves, but for their entire families. One particularly chilling account describes how Caligula would force these women to strip naked and perform various sexual acts while he watched from his throne. Sometimes bringing in multiple women simultaneously to compete for his attention. The psychological torture was as calculated as the physical abuse. These proud Roman matrons who had once commanded respect throughout the empire were reduced to sexual playthings for the emperor's amusement. What made Caligula's transformation of the palace particularly horrifying wasn't just the sexual abuse itself. It was how methodically he used sex as a weapon to destroy the Roman social order. He understood that by forcing the empire's most respected citizens to participate in or witness acts of sexual degradation, he could break their spirits more completely than any torture. The emperor began hosting elaborate dinner parties that started as normal social gatherings but inevitably devolved into orgies. He would invite senators along with their wives and daughters, initially maintaining the pretense of civilized entertainment. But as the evening progressed, the emperor would begin making increasingly inappropriate demands. Senator Marcus, Caligula might say, his voice carrying the casual tone of someone asking for more wine. "Your wife has such beautiful eyes, I wonder what they would look like when she's on her knees before me." The senator would be forced to sit in silence, knowing that any protest would result in his family's execution. Meanwhile, his wife would be compelled to comply with whatever sexual act the emperor demanded, often while her husband and children watched in horror. The psychological damage to these families was often irreparable. Marriages destroyed, children traumatized, proud Roman bloodlines reduced to instruments of the emperor's perverse pleasure. Caligula took particular delight in forcing senators to watch as their wives were sexually degraded. He would arrange special seating so that husbands had clear views of their wives being forced to perform oral sex or engage in intercourse with the emperor or his designated partners. The men's faces, a mixture of rage, helplessness, and shame, seemed to provide Caligula with as much satisfaction as the sexual acts themselves. The imperial palace complex on the Palatine Hill underwent physical modifications to accommodate Caligula's increasingly elaborate sexual fantasies. He commissioned special chambers designed specifically for group sexual activities, complete with elaborate staging and viewing areas. Ancient architectural fragments suggest rooms where normal furniture was replaced with couches arranged in circles, allowing for maximum visibility of sexual activities from multiple angles. One room, according to surviving accounts, was designed like a small amphitheater with raised seating around a central area where the emperor would stage sexual performances. He would force captured enemies, slaves, and sometimes even Roman citizens to engage in various sexual acts while audiences of senators and their families were compelled to watch and applaud. The emperor's bedroom became a particular source of terror for palace inhabitants. Unlike the private quarters of previous emperors, Caligula's chamber was equipped with viewing areas and multiple entrances, allowing him to bring in audiences to witness his sexual encounters. He seemed to derive as much pleasure from being watched as from the acts themselves, treating intercourse as a public demonstration of his absolute power. Caligula also established what could only be described as a brothel within the palace walls, staffed by the wives and daughters of senators who had fallen out of favor. These women were forced to service not only the emperor, but also his guests, foreign dignitaries, and sometimes even common soldiers as a form of ultimate humiliation. The emperor would often personally oversee these activities, providing commentary and direction like a theater director staging a play. Perhaps most shocking of all was how Caligula incorporated sexual degradation into the religious and political ceremonies that formed the backbone of Roman civilization. Traditional rituals that had been performed with solemn dignity for centuries were perverted into opportunities for sexual humiliation. During formal Senate meetings, the emperor would sometimes demand that senators' wives perform sexual services while their husbands conducted official business. The sacred act of governance became inseparable from sexual degradation, with Rome's most important political decisions being made while the empire's most powerful men were forced to watch their families being abused. Religious ceremonies were similarly corrupted. Caligula claimed divine status and demanded that religious rituals include sexual acts performed in his honor. Priestesses who had taken vows of chastity were forced to engage in public intercourse as part of worship services. While traditional religious festivals became excuses for elaborate orgies featuring unwilling participants from Rome's noble families, the emperor's marriage ceremonies became particularly notorious. He married and divorced multiple times, often within the span of days, using each wedding as an opportunity to sexually humiliate the bride's family. One account describes how he forced a bride's father to watch as he consummated the marriage in front of the entire wedding party, treating the sacred act of marriage as a public demonstration of conquest. Caligula's sexual appetites weren't just about personal gratification. They became a form of economic terrorism against Rome's wealthy families. The emperor would identify the most beautiful wives and daughters of wealthy citizens, then demand sexual access to them in exchange for their families' continued safety and prosperity. This created a grotesque marketplace where Roman nobles were forced to offer their female relatives as payment for political favor or simple survival. Families would receive invitations for their women to attend private audiences with the emperor, knowing full well what these meetings entailed, but unable to refuse without risking everything they owned. The emperor also established a formal taxation system based on sexual services. Wealthy families were required to provide their women for specific periods of service in the palace, with the duration and frequency determined by their financial status. This wasn't prostitution in any traditional sense. It was sexual slavery imposed on the empire's most privileged classes as a demonstration of absolute imperial power. Women who tried to resist or escape these arrangements faced horrific punishments. Some were forced to engage in public sexual acts as entertainment during gladiatorial games. Others were sold into actual prostitution, their noble status stripped away as they were forced to service common soldiers and slaves. The message was clear. No one, regardless of birth or status, was beyond the emperor's sexual reach. The impact on the women forced to participate in Caligula's sexual theater was devastating and long-lasting. These were women who had been raised in the strict moral codes of Roman aristocracy, taught that their virtue was their most precious possession and that their primary duty was to their families and the empire. Suddenly finding themselves reduced to sexual objects for the emperor's entertainment created psychological trauma that extended far beyond the physical abuse. Many women were forced to perform acts that violated not only their personal dignity but their deepest religious beliefs. The cognitive dissonance between their upbringing and their forced participation in sexual degradation often led to complete psychological breakdown. Some women attempted suicide rather than comply with the emperor's demands. But Caligula had anticipated this response. Families of women who killed themselves faced collective punishment. Sometimes execution, sometimes financial ruin that destroyed entire bloodlines. This created a situation where women were trapped between their personal honor and their responsibility to their families with no choice that didn't result in devastating consequences. The emperor seemed to take particular pleasure in breaking the spirits of women who initially resisted his advances. He would subject them to increasingly degrading sexual acts until they eventually submitted completely. Their resistance crushed by the relentless application of imperial power. These broken women would then be used as examples to intimidate others. Their complete submission serving as a warning of what happened to those who defied the emperor's will. Perhaps even more psychologically devastating was the forced complicity of Roman men in their families' sexual degradation. Senators and other high-ranking officials were not merely passive witnesses to their wives' and daughters' abuse. They were often required to participate actively in arranging and facilitating these encounters. Caligula would demand that fathers personally deliver their daughters to his chambers, that husbands assist in preparing their wives for sexual encounters, or that brothers help restrain their sisters during group sexual activities. This forced participation created a level of psychological trauma that went beyond simple witnessing. These men became accomplices in their own family's destruction. The emperor understood that by making these men complicit in the sexual abuse of their loved ones, he was destroying their ability to maintain any sense of personal honor or dignity. The senator, who had helped tie his own wife down for the emperor's pleasure, could never again command the same respect in the Roman Senate. His authority was permanently compromised by his participation in his family's degradation. Some men attempted to resist by refusing to bring their female relatives to palace gatherings, but Caligula had prepared for this as well. Families who failed to comply with sexual demands faced immediate execution, often carried out in public as a warning to others. The choice was simple. Participate in your family's sexual abuse or watch them die. One of the most disturbing aspects of Caligula's sexual reign of terror was his inclusion of children in palace activities. While ancient sources are understandably vague about specific details, they make clear that the emperor's sexual appetites extended to minors, both male and female, from Rome's most prominent families. Children who were brought to palace gatherings were forced to witness sexual acts that no child should see, creating psychological trauma that would affect them for the rest of their lives. Some were forced to participate in sexual activities themselves. Their innocence destroyed as part of the emperor's campaign to corrupt every aspect of Roman society. The long-term impact on these children was devastating. Many grew up unable to form normal relationships. Their understanding of sexuality forever warped by their childhood experiences in the imperial palace. Others became perpetrators themselves, carrying forward the cycle of sexual abuse as they reached adulthood and positions of power. Caligula seemed to understand that by sexually traumatizing the children of Rome's elite, he was ensuring that his corruption would outlast his own reign. These children would grow up to be the next generation of Roman leaders. But they would carry with them the psychological scars of their experiences in the palace, potentially perpetuating cycles of abuse for decades to come. As his reign progressed, Caligula began to formalize his sexual practices into a kind of religious cult centered around imperial worship. He declared himself a living god and demanded that sexual acts performed in his honor be treated as religious rituals. This wasn't mere megalomania. It was a calculated attempt to legitimize his sexual abuse by cloaking it in religious authority. Temples were established within the palace complex where worshippers were required to engage in sexual acts as demonstrations of devotion to the divine emperor. These weren't voluntary religious practices. They were mandatory sexual performances required of anyone seeking imperial favor or simply trying to avoid imperial wrath. The emperor created elaborate ceremonies around his sexual activities complete with formal protocols and ritualistic elements. Sexual intercourse with the emperor or his designated representatives became a form of communion with the divine, while watching these acts became a form of worship required of palace visitors. This religious framework provided Caligula with justification for even his most extreme sexual demands. When senators' wives were forced to engage in group sexual activities, it was presented as a religious obligation rather than mere imperial whim. When children were included in sexual rituals, it was described as initiating them into divine mysteries rather than child abuse. Caligula's sexual terrorism wasn't limited to the palace itself. It extended throughout the empire through a network of officials who carried out similar practices in his name. Provincial governors, military commanders, and other imperial representatives were encouraged to establish their own versions of the emperor's sexual court, creating an empire-wide system of sexual exploitation and abuse. These local officials understood that their continued favor with the emperor depended on their willingness to participate in and facilitate sexual abuse. They competed with each other to devise increasingly creative forms of sexual humiliation, sending reports back to Rome detailing their innovations in the hope of gaining imperial recognition. The result was an empire where sexual abuse became a standard tool of governance. Local populations lived in constant fear that their wives, daughters, or sons might be selected for sexual service to imperial officials. This created a climate of terror that extended far beyond the palace walls, affecting millions of people throughout the Roman world. Women throughout the empire learned to live with the knowledge that their bodies were not their own, that at any moment they might be claimed by imperial representatives for sexual purposes. This systematic sexual terrorism became one of the defining characteristics of Caligula's reign, leaving psychological scars that would affect Roman society for generations. By 40 CE, Caligula's sexual excesses had reached levels that shocked even those who had witnessed his earlier depravities. Palace gatherings had devolved into elaborate sexual spectacles that could last for days with hundreds of participants forced to engage in increasingly extreme acts. The emperor's final months were marked by sexual performances of unprecedented scale and cruelty. He would stage massive orgies involving senators, their families, foreign dignitaries, slaves, and even animals, creating sexual tableaux that served as demonstrations of his absolute power over human dignity and morality. These final performances seemed designed not just for personal gratification, but as statements about the nature of imperial power itself. By forcing Rome's most respected citizens to participate in the most degrading sexual acts, Caligula was making a philosophical point about the meaninglessness of traditional Roman values in the face of absolute authority. The breaking point came when Caligula announced his intention to make his sexual practices the official religion of the empire. Requiring all Roman citizens to participate in sexual rituals as demonstrations of loyalty. This threat to formalize and universalize his sexual terrorism was what finally convinced the conspiracy against him to act. On January 24, 41 CE, Caligula was assassinated by members of the Taurian Guard in the underground passages of his own palace. But even in death, the emperor's sexual crimes continued to terrorize their victims. The conspiracy included not just political motivations, but personal ones. Several of the assassins had been forced to watch their own family members subjected to the emperor's sexual abuse. The new Emperor Claudius faced the enormous task of dealing with the aftermath of Caligula's sexual reign of terror. The physical evidence of the emperor's crimes was extensive. Rooms equipped for sexual torture, collections of pornographic art depicting real palace victims, detailed records of sexual encounters that served as blackmail material against prominent families. Much of this evidence was quietly destroyed, not out of respect for Caligula's memory, but to protect the victims and their families from further humiliation. Rooms that had been sites of sexual abuse were sealed or completely renovated, as if the new administration was trying to erase the physical memory of what had occurred. The cover-up extended to the historical record as well. While ancient historians clearly documented Caligula's sexual crimes, they used coded language that obscured the full extent of the abuse. Many victims and their families preferred this discretion, understanding that detailed accounts of their experiences would only perpetuate their humiliation. The most tragic aspect of Caligula's sexual terrorism was how effectively it silenced its victims. The Roman social system with its emphasis on honor and family reputation made it nearly impossible for survivors to speak openly about their experiences without destroying what remained of their social standing. Women who had been sexually abused by the emperor faced a society that would blame them for their victimization regardless of the circumstances. Men who had been forced to watch their wives' sexual degradation couldn't speak about their experiences without admitting their own powerlessness and complicity. Children who had witnessed or experienced sexual abuse often carried their trauma in silence for their entire lives. This conspiracy of silence meant that the full extent of Caligula's sexual crimes may never be known. Families destroyed by sexual abuse had every incentive to hide their experiences. While historical accounts were necessarily limited by social conventions that made explicit discussion of sexual matters inappropriate for public consumption. The silence also meant that many victims never received justice or even acknowledgement of their suffering. The new imperial administration was focused on political stability rather than addressing past abuses, leaving survivors to cope with their trauma without support or recognition. The sexual crimes committed in Caligula's palace had consequences that extended far beyond his 4-year reign. The psychological trauma inflicted on Rome's elite created generational patterns of dysfunction that affected Roman society for decades to come. Children who had witnessed or experienced sexual abuse in the palace grew up with profoundly damaged understandings of sexuality, power, and human relationships. Many became perpetrators themselves, unable to distinguish between normal sexual expression and the abusive practices they had learned in childhood. Others became victims again, their childhood trauma making them vulnerable to further exploitation. The families that survived Caligula's reign often found themselves permanently marked by their experiences. Marriages destroyed by forced sexual encounters never recovered, while children raised in environments of sexual terror struggled to form healthy relationships as adults. The social fabric of Roman aristocracy was permanently damaged by the systematic sexual abuse of its most prominent members. Perhaps most significantly, Caligula's sexual terrorism established patterns of imperial abuse that would resurface throughout Roman history. Later emperors, while perhaps not matching Caligula's extremes, understood that sexual exploitation was a powerful tool for maintaining control over subordinates and eliminating political opposition. Today, tourists walk through the ruins of the Palatine Hill, marveling at the remnants of imperial grandeur without fully understanding the horrors that once unfolded within these crumbling walls. The marble floors that once echoed with the screams and sobs of unwilling victims now host guided tours and scholarly lectures about ancient Roman architecture. But if you know what to look for, the evidence remains. Foundation stones that once supported rooms designed specifically for sexual torture. Drainage systems that carried away the physical evidence of countless assaults. Underground passages where terrified victims waited their turn to be summoned to the emperor's presence. The ghosts of Caligula's victims still haunt these ruins. The senator's wife who killed herself rather than endure another night of imperial attention. The 10-year-old boy who watched his mother being sexually tortured. The proud Roman matron who was forced to work as a prostitute in the palace brothel. Their stories were deliberately erased from history, but their suffering remains embedded in the very stones of this place. Caligula's transformation of the imperial palace into a theater of sexual horror lasted less than 4 years, but its impact echoed through Roman history and continues to resonate today. The emperor's crimes remind us that sexual abuse has always been a weapon of choice for those who seek to dominate and control others, and that the most elaborate systems of civilization can be corrupted by individuals who recognize no limits on their exercise of power. The palace may be ruins now, but its lessons endure. The systematic sexual abuse of the vulnerable by those in positions of authority isn't a relic of ancient barbarism. It's a pattern that repeats itself whenever human beings are given absolute power over others and choose to use it for evil. The only difference between Caligula's sexual terrorism and modern forms of abuse is the scale and the documentation. The fundamental dynamics of power, control, and sexual exploitation remain disturbingly consistent across the centuries. In the end, the emperor who turned his palace into an orgy left behind more than just traumatized survivors and political chaos. He created a template for sexual terrorism that would be studied and sometimes emulated by tyrants throughout history. His legacy is written not in marble monuments or bronze inscriptions, but in the psychological scars passed down through generations of victims, a reminder that the worst crimes are often those that destroy not just bodies, but souls.